Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's CJ. I want to welcome you guys to episode 2 of my brand new 120 gallon reef system. Now we're going to focus on the sump and a few things I've done to modify this and to improve it based on my equipment and based on the way I want it to function. So let's get to it. Now this sump did include a thin foam mat for underneath. It's pretty much the same with any rimless tank. Because they're rimless, they really don't do well with imperfections as far as the stand. It can lead to points of pressure and lead to, eventual failure of the tank. So I'm going to remove this, clean this stand up, and we're going to change it over to a little something, a little better for the eyes. So instead of styrofoam, decided to switch over to your standard blue yoga mat. My plan is, to help eliminate vibrations in the tank, also catch any water that's dripping, make it easier to clean, and it just looks better overall. So let's keep it moving. Now, I know some new people in the hobby may look at this sump and, wonder why even change it. What's the point? Well, honestly, it's all about efficiency and functionality for me. I got a certain design in mind that I want for this sump, and the way it flows from left to right now, it would pretty much make you install some kind of filter sock, which I don't like. We'll talk more about that later. And then the skimmer section on the right is right before the return section. So those two things alone are enough for me to pull this sump and make all the changes we're going to do, amongst other things that I can kind of, tweak to make a little better as well. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now, just like anything else in this hobby, there's always more than one way to do it. So trust me, this is not the end all be all as far as how-to videos by a long shot. I'm just sharing with you the way I did it and, the tools I used. Now, the most important tool had to have been these razor blades. Now, this is just a cheap clip with 10 replaceable blades included. Was an invaluable tool to get this job done. Now, you can use whatever you want to use to plane the glass. I prefer alcohol. It works well. And it also helps remove marker, for making marks to keep your baffles level on both sides of the glass. That's very important. Now, last but not least, let's talk a little bit about silicone. Now, I will remind you, this is my second time building a sump. My first one was years ago with my first reef tank. And at the time, I didn't understand the value of a caulk gun and using the silicone cartridge. So after squeezing a little tube of silicone over and over and over again, decided to never make that mistake again, especially with building a bigger sump. Now what you're looking at now are two different types of silicone. The first one is reef safe, the second one is not. Now I mention this because, there's multiple ways to approach this situation. You can either stick with aquarium manufactured silicone that you know is 100% safe, or you can go the route I did and go to your local, hardware store and buy 100% silicone. Now, unfortunately, my first choice was the wrong one. I purchased the one with mold inhibitors. Only come to find out that, these are actually dangerous for your reef tank. So I want to make sure I mention that in this video. And if you make the mistake like I did, do not be afraid to go ahead and cut it all out of your sump again and start over with the silicone that you should have used the first time. So figured I'll take a moment and mention this for anyone that's new in the hobby. Don't want you to repeat the same mistake I did, or even worse, leave it in your sump and roll with it, only to have everything die later down the line. So other than that, let's go ahead and keep it moving, keep the build going. Now I have to admit, these baffles were a lot harder to cut out than I imagined. I don't know if the manufacturer used some kind of industrial grade silicone or something that was a little harder than usual, but it was not easy at all. But nevertheless, I had to get this done by any means necessary, with the main goal being to not let the razor blade get caught or snagged in some kind of way that it end up flipping around and, slicing me to pieces. So as you can tell, pretty straightforward. Once you get it in there, run it down along the seam, multiple times on both sides, and then just move the glass out of the way. So, it's pretty straightforward and simple. So once the baffles are removed, it's pretty much all about preparation at this point. The goal being to remove all silicone, debris, wiping it off with alcohol, anything that can get in the way of a strong bond whenever you glue these baffles back in. So pretty much a little busy work, nothing major, just a little time consuming. So at this point, baffle's been removed, the sump's been vacuumed out. So it's all about wiping everything down with alcohol and getting all the surfaces ready and prepped for more silicone. Now, in most situations, I would just rinse this tank out, dry it out with a towel, but it's a little too big to take outside, so I decided to just wipe it down in the house. Now, gluing the baffles back in was pretty straightforward. There was a significant gap between the baffle and the glass, so I had to use a lot more silicone this first time to kind of fill that gap, and of course made a huge mess. So I'm definitely not an expert with a caulk gun and silicone by any means, and just enough to get the job done. The good news is anytime you're dealing with silicone, once it cures, no matter how much you overdid it, you can always come back with a razor blade and clean up your mistake, get a straight line, and make it look a lot better. So don't sweat it. It's all about the seal and not about the look. So at this point, it's pretty much the same process over and over for each baffle. One word of advice I will say, make sure you draw guidelines from the bottom all the way up to the top of the sump. That way when you're lining your baffles up, there's no eyeballing it, there's no guesswork involved. Line it up, glue it, and keep it moving. Now, of course, once you get it all set up, get everything supported the way you want, let it cure overnight, so that way when it comes time to, cutting the extra silicone off, nothing's gooey, nothing's nasty, everything comes off nice and clean. So at this point, the tank's been drying and curing all night, and it also allowed me to get in there with the razor blade and do my best to clean up the extra silicone that's around the baffles and that horrible job I did earlier. But as far as, any functional purposes, the sump's ready to go. But we're not going to stop there. I have a certain theme in mind I want for under the tank. It does not involve a clear, see-through sump. So got it taped off, ready to go. So let's go ahead and get it painted. It took me roughly 2 days to complete this project. It was pretty much all busy work cutting the baffles out, gluing them in, and then waiting a majority of the time. Waiting on the silicone to cure, and then of course waiting on the paint to dry. But other than that, really happy with how this turned out. The sump's underneath the stand, the equipment fits exactly where I wanted it to fit, and pretty much everything went as planned. So we're going to take a minute, run through the sump, and I'm going to explain some of the changes I've made, the overall plans I have for my filtration, and then of course, a few calculations I made to make sure that I was safe. And by safe, I'm talking about, flooding the tank or flooding my house in the case of a power outage. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now the flow in this sump still goes from left to right like before, but there has been some changes. It starts in the first chamber. Everything flows over the top of that first baffle, goes into the mechanical filtration area, down into the skimmer section, through the bubble trap, then it gets into the refugium. Now it flows from bottom to top in the refugium, mixes up, keeps good water movement, and then it goes right into the return section. Now besides the water flow, there are still a few other things that are very important when building your sump, and the most important one, especially for the first 2 chambers, is access. More than likely, if you have a fish make its way down into your sump, it's always going to end up in these first 2 chambers. If you can't get your hand in there or a net or some way to get it out, you're pretty much, SOL. So definitely account for it and plan for it. Now, when it comes to mechanical filtration, I've addressed this the easiest way possible. Basically have the water overflowing the baffle, falling through a filter tray, and ending up right into the skimmer section. Now the idea is to allow me to stuff this area with filter flaws, polyfilter pads, any kind of media that catches materials, detritus, whatever the case may be, and then replace it, throw it away as needed. Now if it clogs, no worries, it'll just overflow that baffle. I give it about a 3-inch gap right into the skimmer section, and life goes on. Now when it comes to my skimmer, only 2 things I care about: the water level being consistent and micro bubbles not making it to my display. Now the first one, really easy. Water flows from left to right, so keep in mind, even though the filter tray is higher than the skimmer, the water level is dictated by the baffle to the right at around 8 inches, should be fine. And as far as micro bubbles, if they do survive this section, by the time they make it all the way through the refugium, they've had plenty of time to dissipate and will never make it back to my display. Now when it comes to my refugium section, I have the bubble traps set to allow water to flow underneath and not just over top. I'm not going to have a situation to where I have a deep sand bed or something that requires low flow. My refugium is basically going to be, an equipment area / pond matrix / possible frag regulator down the road. So I'm going to need as much flow as possible through the refugium to accomplish those things. Other than that, should be pretty straightforward, should stay clean, and should be a great place for pods to grow. And the return section remained unchanged. I like the idea of the refugium flowing over this baffle into the return section and hopefully, allowing any pods or microfauna to be able to make it through the return back into my display to help seed the tank. Now, even though my sump's complete, the thought did cross my mind to downsize to a smaller sump just to give me a little more headroom and a little more room for equipment inside the stand. So I'm going to run you guys through a few calculations I ran that may help someone else that's new, especially when it comes to, power outages. Is water going to flood my house or my sump, and how to deal with it. Now, the calculations are really simple for this. You basically take the length times the width times the height of the area that you're measuring and divide it by 231, and that'll give you the exact gallons or a rough estimate of the gallons for that space. So if you was to apply that to my system, I have a 120 gallon tank that's 48 inches long by 24 inches wide, and the only X factor is going to be the height. That's what you need to find out. Now, the height in my situation is basically going to be measured from the top of the overflow down to the bottom of the teeth, because that's pretty much the water level and the amount it's going to drain in the event of a power outage. Now, you also want to keep in mind your return lines will affect this number due to back siphoning, so it's a good idea to keep them right at or just above the water surface. Otherwise, you're going to have to add that into your calculation. So with all that being said, if I take 48 times 24 times 2 and divide that by 231, that gives me roughly 10 gallons. Now, guys with calculators, don't tell me it's wrong. I know it's 9.9 something, but this is just for estimate's sake. So I get 10 gallons coming from the display, and let's say the PVC piping holds maybe a gallon or two. Puts us at around 12 gallons. So now we know the magic number. I would say anywhere between 12 and 15 gallons is the ballpark you're aiming for to make sure you don't overflow or flood your house in the event of a power outage. Now, that applies to any size sump. No matter what dimension, it could be a 40 breeder, 30 long, whatever the case may be. As long as it has that much free space, you're good to go. So let's apply that same math to the sump I currently have. Now, this is roughly 50 gallons or so. It measures around 40 by 17 by 17, give or take. Now, the main thing to consider with a sump like this is how much water I'm going to need in here to run my equipment. And that's all determined by the skimmer. If you guys remember before, said that baffle was around 8 inches, 9 inches or so. That pretty much is the water level in this sump. So now I got to run the calculation based off what's empty. Now, this is not a situation that you want to let the baffles confuse you. They will not affect at all what happens during a power outage. The water will rise above them, around them. It will just fill the tank no matter what. So with all those things being considered, this sump being 17 inches high, let's say I have a 9-inch baffle already, that leaves 8 inches of usable space empty in this sump. So we'd use the formula. We take the length, 40 inches, times the width, 17, times the height of available space, which is 8, divide that by 231, and that gives us approximately 23 gallons, give or take for those with calculators. This is pretty much a prime example of how using math can give you plenty of peace of mind. I know for a fact that during a power outage, I'm going to easily have between 5 and 8 gallons to spare, and it pretty much won't even rise to the top of my sump. So, if anyone is curious or just wondering how small of a sump you can get away with, use this formula and it'll definitely get you there. So with all that being said, it's a pretty good point to stop this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, watching and hearing my thoughts as far as building a sump and some of the changes for my filtration and just my plans going forward. And with all of that, still a lot more to do. Still got to plumb this tank. Still have some modifications in the work for the canopy, aquascaping, tons of videos to come. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And as always, hey, you guys like, comment, subscribe. You guys do what y'all do. Y'all be easy. Happy reefing.